The Buddha and his anatta. Is unselfish joy practicable? The awakened one, the Buddha, said, "Here, O monks, a disciple lets his mind pervade 1/4 of the world with thoughts of unselfish joy, and so the second, and so the third, and so the fourth. And thus the whole wide world, above, below, around, everywhere and equally, he continues to pervade with a heart of unselfish joy, abundant, grown great, measureless, without hostility or ill will. The virtue of mudita, finding joy in the happiness and success of others, has not received sufficient attention either in expositions of Buddhist ethics or in the meditative development of the 4 sublime states, Brahma Vihara, of which mudita is one. It was, therefore, thought desirable to compile this little book of essays and texts, and to mention in this introduction a few supplementary features of this rather neglected subject. It has been rightly stated that it is relatively easier for man to feel compassion or friendliness in situations which demand them than to cherish a spontaneous feeling of shared joy outside a narrow circle of one's family and friends. It mostly requires a deliberate effort to identify oneself with the joys and successes of others. Yet the capacity of doing so has psychological roots in man's nature, which may be even deeper than his compassionate responses. There is firstly the fact that people do like to feel happy, with or without good reason, and would prefer it to the shared sadness of compassion. Man's gregarious nature, his sociability, already gives him some familiarity with shared emotions and shared pleasure, though mostly on a much lower level than that of our present concern. There is also in man, and in some animals, not only an aggressive impulse, but also a natural bent towards mutual aid and cooperative action. Furthermore, there is the fact that happiness is infectious, and an unselfish joy can easily grow out of it. Children readily respond by their own smiles and happy mood to smiling faces and happiness around them. Though children can be quite jealous and envious at times, they also can visibly enjoy it when they have made a playmate happy by a little gift, and they are then quite pleased with themselves. Let parents and educators wisely encourage this potential in the child. Then this seed will quite naturally grow into a strong plant in the adolescent and the adult, maturing from impulsive and simple manifestations into the sublime state of unselfish joy, mudita brahmavihara. Thus here too the child may become the father of a man. Such education towards joy with others should, of course, not be given in a dry, didactic manner, but chiefly in a practical way by gently making the child observe, appreciate, and enjoy the happiness and success of others, and by trying himself to create a little joy in others. This can be aided by acquainting the child with examples of selfless lives and actions for his joyful admiration of them, and these, of course, should not be limited to Buddhist history. This feature should not be absent in Buddhist youth literature and school books throughout all age groups. And this theme should be continued in Buddhist magazines and literature for adults. Admittedly, the negative impulses in man, like aggression, envy, jealousy, etc., are much more in evidence than his positive tendencies towards communal service, mutual aid, unselfish joy, generous appreciation of the good qualities of his fellow men, etc. Yet, as all these positive features are definitely found in man, though rarely developed, it is quite realistic to appeal to them and activate and develop that potential by whatever means we can in our personal relationships, in education, etc. If it were impossible to cultivate the good, I would not tell you to do so, said the Buddha. This is, indeed, a positive, optimistic assurance. If this potential for unselfish joy is widely and methodically encouraged and developed, starting with the Buddhist child, or, for that matter, with any child, and continued with adults, individuals, and Buddhist groups, including the Sangha, the seed of mudita can grow into a strong plant which will blossom forth and find fruition in many other virtues as a kind of beneficial chain reaction. Magnanimity, tolerance, generosity of both heart and purse, friendliness, and compassion. When unselfish joy grows, many noxious weeds in the human heart will die a natural death, or will, at least, shrink. Jealousy and envy, ill will in various degrees and manifestations, cold-heartedness, miserliness, also in one's concern for others, and so forth. Unselfish joy can indeed act as a powerful agent in releasing dormant forces of the good in the human heart. We know very well how envy and jealousy, the chief opponents of unselfish joy, can poison a man's character as well as the social relationships on many levels of his life. They can paralyze the productivity of society on governmental, professional, industrial, and commercial levels. Should not, therefore, all effort be made to cultivate their antidote, that is, mudita? Mudita will also vitalize and ennoble charitable and social work, while compassion, karuna, is or should be the inspiration for it. Unselfish joy should be its boon companion. Mudita will prevent compassionate action from being marred by a condescending and patronizing attitude which often repels or hurts the recipient. Also, when active compassion and unselfish joy go together, it will be less likely that works of service turn into dead routine performed indifferently. Indifference, listlessness, boredom, all nuances of the Pali term arati, are said to be the distant enemies of mudita. They can be vanquished by an alliance of compassion and unselfish joy. In him who gives and helps, the joy he finds in such action will enhance the blessings imparted by these wholesome deeds. Unselfishness will become more and more natural to him, and such ethical unselfishness will help him towards a better appreciation and the final realization of the Buddha's central doctrine of no self, anatta. He will also find it confirmed that he who is joyful in his heart will gain easier the serenity of a concentrated mind. These are, indeed, great blessings which the cultivation of joy with others' happiness can bestow. Nowadays, moral exhortations fall increasingly on deaf ears, whether they are motivated theologically or otherwise. Preaching morals with an admonishing finger is now widely resented and rejected. This fact worries greatly the churches and educators in the West, but there are ample indications that this may, more or less, happen also in the Buddhist countries of the East, where ethics is still taught and preached in the old hortatory style and mostly in a rather stereotype and unimaginative way, with little reference to present-day moral and social problems. Hence, modern youth will increasingly feel that such moralizings are not their concern. In fact, within the frame of the Buddhist teachings, which do not rely on the authoritarian commandments of God and Church, but on man's innate capacity for self-purification, such conventionalized presentation of ethics, which chiefly relies on overworked scriptural references, must appear quite incongruous and will prove increasingly ineffective for young and old alike. The need for reform in this field is urgent and of vital importance. It was also with this situation in view that the preceding observations have stressed the fact that a virtue like unselfish and altruistic joy has its natural roots in the human heart and can be of immediate benefit to the individual and society. In other words, the approach to a modern presentation of Buddhist ethics should be pragmatic and contemporary, enlivened by a genuine and warm-hearted human concern. In this troubled world of ours, there are plenty of opportunities for thoughts and deeds of compassion, but there seem to be all too few for sharing in others' joy. Hence, It is necessary for us to create new opportunities for unselfish joy by the active practice of loving kindness, metta, and compassion, karuna, in deeds, words, and meditative thought. Yet, in a world that can never be without disappointments and failures, we must also arm ourselves with the equanimity, upekkha, to protect us from discouragement and feelings of frustration, should we encounter difficulties in our efforts to expand the realm of unselfish joy. Unselfish joy, a neglected virtue. Mudita, unselfish or sympathetic joy, is one of the most neglected topics within the whole range of the Buddha Dhamma, probably because of its subtlety and of the wealth of nuances latent within it. Besides getting honorable mention within the context of the Four Divine Abidings, Brahma Vihara, few commentators have had much more to say about it apart from explaining that it means sympathetic joy at the good fortune or success of others. Only one notable writer, Kanze, in Buddhist thought in India, has had the insight to suggest that mudita, that is, sympathy, is a prerequisite of metta, loving kindness, and of karuna, compassion. He thus names appreciation as one of the components of mudita. How right he is, for one cannot appreciate another person without seeing some good in him. If one does not appreciate the other person in the slightest degree, one would be hard put to experience joy at any stroke of good fortune or success that may befall him. To stimulate feelings of pleasure when, in fact, one feels none would be the grossest of hypocrisy. Thus, mudita tacitly implies looking for the good in others and learning to recognize and admire what good there is. Likewise, if one has a misanthropic view of mankind, regarding people as essentially evil and not worth being concerned about, one cannot, on the face of it, make much headway with any of the Four Divine Abidings. To have a sympathetic attitude towards human beings does not betoken an idealization of man, but rather a realistic appraisal that, though often in error and grievously at fault, man has, nevertheless, the potential to rise above his darkness and ignorance into the light of knowledge, and even to undreamed of heights of nirvana. Unless one has that measure of faith and confidence in mankind which the Buddha himself had, the practice of metta and karuna is impossible. Thus, the broadest and most simple aspect of mudita, as sympathy towards mankind, is also the most basic and important. To regard mudita as being relevant only on certain relatively rare occasions when our friends and acquaintances come into a bonanza of some kind is to fragment it and render it trivial, thereby missing the essential matrix. It should not be regarded as a matter of turning on a tap from which mudita will gush forth. There should be, in a certain sense, a quiet stream of sympathy and understanding flowing within the individual all the time. Though, to be sure, it does also mean developing the capacity to participate in another person's finest hour and doing so spontaneously and sincerely. It is indeed a depressing fact that people are much more ready to sympathize with the misfortunes of others than to rejoice with them, a psychological quirk in people which wrung from Montaigne the ironic statement, "There is something altogether not too displeasing in the misfortunes of our friends." Turning back to the essential matrix of mudita as sympathy towards mankind, faith in its potential for good and acceptance of its worthwhileness, this is precisely what is lacking in the world today. There is abroad a kind of cosmic gloom and, among some large sections of people, a feeling of defeatism. Probably the scene is largely colored by the shadow of the hydrogen bomb and the various other horrible weapons of destruction which we know the nations are so busy in manufacturing. All in all, too much has happened in too short a time. More scientific and technological discoveries have been telescoped into the last 50, or is it 30, years than in the previous 500, and the total result is, at the moment, of dubious benefit to humanity as a whole, though of inestimable worth to the new millionaires who have managed to muscle in on the expanding economy. Electric and nuclear power, the spectacular forging ahead of communication, transport, and industry have brought in their wake such negative byproducts as overpopulation, more and more urbanization into colossal, concentrated centers such as Tokyo, New York, and London, and even Sydney and Melbourne, which in turn has given rise to other unfortunate results, both physical and psychological: pollution from industrial waste, destruction of natural resources, individual desocialization, alienation, stress, as evidenced by the delinquency figures, the drift to drugs, character disorders, feelings of the meaninglessness of life, rise in crime, wanton destructiveness, a sure symptom of frustration and an unlived life, despair, suicide. We know that such ills have always existed in society, and that probably they always will to some degree. But the frightening thing about the present situation is that they are insidiously increasing, in spite of the fact that many people, and especially the youth, have never had it so good. As it is, man feels more insecure than ever, more uncertain and lost. Viewing these symptoms, many people throughout the world have drawn the conclusion that man has arrived at the period of moral decline and disintegration, and that humanity has become so depraved as to be hopelessly beyond redemption or recall. Such a view has always been characteristic of old age. We can, with a certain degree of amusement, read the lines: "To whom do I speak today? Brothers are evil. Friends today are not of love. To whom do I speak today? Hearts are thievish. Every man seizes his neighbor's goods. To whom do I speak today? The gentle man perishes. The bold-faced goes everywhere. To whom do I speak today? When a man should arouse wrath by his evil conduct, he stirs all men to mirth, although his iniquity is wicked." The above admonition was composed in ancient Egypt during the Middle Kingdom, thousands of years ago, but the words are those which every generation hears. There is a proneness in periods of crisis and transition to conjure up in the mind a fantasy of a previous golden age, when people were of sterling worth and life was lived in accordance with the noble virtues. But we may well ask, when was there such an age, and where? If people who harbor such quaint notions were to read history, they would realize that such a belief is just about as valid as that there ever was a time when flowers bloomed forever and sweethearts were always true, in the words of the old song. Ancient history and the Middle Ages are definitely out as far as morality is concerned. Without going so far back, merely a couple of hundred years, Smollett wrote this of 18th century England: "Commerce and manufacture flourished to such a degree of increase as has never been known in this island. But this advantage was attended with an irresistible tide of luxury and excess which flowed through all degrees of people, breaking down all the bounds of civil policy and opening a way for licentiousness and immorality. The highways were infested with rapine and assassination. The cities teemed with the brutal votaries of lewdness, intemperance, and profligacy." In the 19th century, relatively recently, Wordsworth wrote, "The wealthiest man among us is the best. No grandeur now in nature or in book. Delight us. Rapine, avarice, expense, this is idolatry, and these we adore. Plain living and high thinking are no more. The homely beauty of the good old cause is gone, our fearful innocence, and pure religion breathing household laws." And James Hemming, a modern writer, in his book Individual Morality. 19th century London was frequently shaken by the destructive antics of informally organized hooligan gangs of young aristocrats. Those young roughs, having idled away their days, spent their nights beating people up, smashing up coffee stalls, alarming women and such like the Bucks, the Corinthians, and all their imitators and hangers-on. Such bands were following, somewhat less cruelly, in the tradition of the nefarious Mohawks who terrorized 18th century London. Sexual propriety. Quoting again from Heming, brothels in the 19th century were big business, and laws to forbid living on the immoral earnings of women, after several rebuffs in Parliament, did not reach the statute books till 1885. But this was in England, the most progressive country in Europe. There is no evidence for believing that conditions were better on the continent. Understandably, 25 years after World War II, we are still appalled by the memory of the Nazi gas chambers and the genocide which was their aim. This is by no means an isolated instance of genocide. History bears witness to similar incidents of destructive hate, culminating in mass murder. The Albigenses were wiped out to a man, and in 1572, at the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve, thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered, Pope Gregory XIII commanding bonfires to be lit and a medal to be struck in celebration. The idea that the mass destruction of one's ideological enemies is justified was already old in the days of the Old Testament. Saul was commanded, "Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not. But slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass." All of the foregoing is not intended as apologetics justifying violence, bloodbaths, or individual or collective acts of immorality, but merely to dispel the myth that there was ever a previous idyllic phase when man could have said with some semblance of truth, "God's in his heaven, and all's right with the world." So let us lay to rest forever the belief that in the past men were truer, kinder, more upright, and generally more worthy than they are today. Let us give that piece of romantic fiction the respectable funeral that it deserves. Our ancestors and predecessors were no better than we are, and we are certainly not worse than they were. In many respects, we have improved considerably on the ways of our forebears. Actually, there has been a great deal of progress considering that slavery hung on in England until 1772, in America till 1863, and serfdom in Russia till 1861. And in spite of the injustices and lack of moral scruples that still exist, there is more awareness, kindliness, and sensitivity in many human societies than there has ever been before. Today, when a national disaster of great magnitude occurs in a country, quite often the rest of the world rallies around and helps. Perhaps not to the extent that it should, but nonetheless to some extent. Such a broadening expansion of the human conscience would have been deemed a utopian ideal in former times and impossible. When acts of genocide were perpetrated in the past, people just accepted it. That was that, and there was nothing to be done about it. In our time, the whole world was revolted by the Nazi gas chambers, eventually rose against the loathsome disease of fascism, and smashed it, even thought it took the combined might of the Allied force 5 years of bitter conflict to do so. However, in the past, without exception, whatever was inflicted upon a people, they mostly took. Today, they don't. They protest, they demonstrate, they kick up a fuss. They have become articulate because they have realized that the greatest evil of all is not poverty, racialism, or war, but powerlessness. Naturally, such an unexpected show of interest in public affairs is embarrassing to governments accustomed to an inert and docile population, and there is some wistful talk by diehards of the silent majority. But the present indications are that the silent majority is likely to become a silent minority in the face of such urgent problems as overpopulation and destruction of natural resources, which, if left unchecked, will make the Earth uninhabitable within a foreseeable future. However, against this general tendency is the lamentable fact that nothing was done about the rape of Tibet, and even now there are no large-scale or forceful protests being made about the genocide that is being practiced in that country by the Chinese. So, far from feeling dejected and dispirited about mankind, we should be hopeful and buoyant. There would be infinitely more cause for alarm and despair if people were as easy to manipulate as sheep, or merely apathetic. The arguing and the restlessness throughout the world is about the principles on which we should run our lives, a struggle for values other than the profit motive, for ways and means to make possible greater cooperation between individuals and nations, and for moral maturity in coping with man's new powers and responsibilities. People discuss, argue, petition, protest, demonstrate because of their sympathy, compassion, and love for mankind. It is very difficult to differentiate between the three, or to recognize precisely the line of demarcation where one ends and the other begins, because they are illimitable. There are, of course, others who see in these conflicts only hatred, but this view is hardly tenable because it is much easier and much more comfortable to remain uninvolved, drifting with the current, nor swimming against it. The Ven, Nyanaponika, has summed up the interdependence of the four divine abidings in the following quotation: "Love imparts to equanimity its selflessness, its boundless nature, and even its fervor. Compassion guards equanimity from falling into cold indifference and keeps it from indolent or selfish isolation. Until equanimity has reached perfection, compassion urges it to enter again and again into the battlefields of the world. Sympathetic joy gives to equanimity the mild serenity that softens its stern appearance. It is the divine smile on the face of the enlightened one.